Welcome to the Only Human podcast, a platform for understanding what makes us human in a pandemic, through a transition, and after a crisis. In this series, we speak to people from a range of backgrounds, industries, and expertise. We then apply an anthropological lens to these perspectives so that we can dig a little deeper and examine the human condition.
Anthropology has long contributed to our understanding of the world as a whole and how behaviors and knowledge systems develop or adapt. This interplay of local and global forces of change gives rise to context-specific tensions that play out in often unexpected ways. If we were to make sense of these emerging paradoxes, we would need both an emic and etic perspective, a view from the inside and the outside, on both the individual and collective levels.
Humans have the capacity to reflect, to consider the impact of their actions, and to act intentionally, as well as interpret the intentions of others. What comes to mind is this illustrative description by Haitian anthropologist Trio in 2003. It's pouring rain out there, and the mosquitoes are starting to bite. In desperation, the baffled anthropologist burns his notes to create a moment of light. He moves his face against the flame, closes his eyes, and, hands grasping the camera, takes a picture of himself.
In this episode, we hear from Babb about navigating polarities and mapping multiple realities. Sarah is a South African facilitator of change and lecturer in managing for change. For more than 20 years, she has created and collaborated on impactful programs and projects relating to leadership, purpose, and transformation.
My name's Sarah Babb. I've been working with complexity and leadership development for over 20 years and really concerned with how do we sustain future systems? How do we equip ourselves and our leaders and our leadership to constantly evolve and adapt in these complex times? And the COVID-19 and pandemic has really given us a sort of global case of how can we find new ways of working and being in our organizations and in this world. So for me, this is really an interesting, important, fascinating moment in our history that we can really be exploring and collaborating together on to find a better way forward. The topic I was going to be thinking through with you is about how do we navigate polarities. So what's coming up for me and for a lot of people in this time of the pandemic is they're experiencing tensions. So tensions between how do they care for themselves and their family, and now that certainly in our country, lockdown is beginning to be lessened, there's a sense of how do I re-enter the world, even whether it's going shopping or whether it's thinking about my team or my future security. How can I be in the world? And there's a tension between individual perspectives as well as what's happening in our country and globally around the pandemic. So I have been quite curious about this and vexed around it, about how do we ourselves navigate polarity so that we can find a better way of flowing and a better way of regenerating and connecting. So what I want to do is really talk through three questions in essence. So the first one is, how do we navigate and understand these tensions and polarities? What are the premises and assumptions behind that? And then the second question is more about, so how do we locate ourselves in this? How do we understand ourselves in this process? The third one is, how do we begin to shift our perspective in these times? And the fourth one is, what can I help enable? How can I shift systems, not just myself, to be more compatible and for humanity and the planet in essence in the future? So to begin with, it's an interesting question to think of ourselves as a reflection of the bigger system. So how we experience the pandemic is actually a reflection of the broader system. So we're a microcosm in ourselves, in our homes, in our organizations. We're a fractal of that broader system. And so if we think of it from that perspective, how we experience this becomes the important insight, but equally the doorway to be able to navigate those tensions. So that's the first premise, is to really see how we experience the difficulty, the uncertainty, the stress, the discomfort, the unexpected joys even, are a reflection of some of those unexpected paradoxes in the bigger system. So we're seeing, for example, that we might be stressed under whether our income's been reduced, whether we've lost employment, whether we see colleagues, or even having to lose some people that we've employed in our homes or in our lives. We've seen that tension counteracted with a lot of joy that people experience being at home with their partners, or finding time to reflect, or time with their children, or unexpected moments that have come through. And we've seen that on a bigger system of growing unemployment, broken supply chains, almost destroyed industries such as the airline industry and restaurant or tourism, versus unexpected moments to reconnect. And that's why it becomes so important that we can actually name some of these polarities. And that's the first step, is to actually begin to map those polarities. So the second thing to realize is that these systems that we live in and these experiences we have are socially constructed. So that means one thing, they're socially constructed, but equally they can also be socially contested. And we're seeing some of that happen, certainly in our country, where initially there was a large sentiment to say our political system is caring for us. So there's lockdown. We have a number of processes to keep us socially isolated, to keep us in hygienic practices of washing hands. But on the other hand, we're now seeing growing poverty, growing unemployment, a contestation of what that lockdown means, where some of the rules are draconian, or the army is being heavy-handed in its control of those. So tensions evolving, but equally realizing that these are socially constructed and can be socially contested. In other words, we can change the realities that we live in, and that really is the underlying point. Also important as a premise before we get fully into polarity management is realizing that multiple realities coexist. So we are all intertwined in different systems that overlap. So even if I come from a particular cultural, social, economic background, I'm completely entwined with a drastically different story and experience of COVID-19, where I have neighbors that are perhaps starving or have different insights and experiences. So we are not right and we are not wrong. That's the first thing I think to realize in polarity management. I have a perspective, and each perspective is equally valid. And in fact, if we're going to navigate the future, one of our capacities is to be able to really listen and hear to multiple realities, really be able to understand different narratives, different experiences, because it's a gap between those that will give us new insights or new ways forward. In my neighborhood, where we have diverse economic, political, social realities coexisting, I've been quite struck by some of the stories and experiences of how new ecosystems are emerging. So just yesterday, about 5 restaurants announced a collaboration. They'll be working out of one restaurant, kitchen, and from there, they'll be serving food parcels, soup kitchens, and being able to deliver, which are what we're allowed to do now, deliver meals to the home. So there's different ecosystems emerging, using local suppliers who grow the product, and using only local distribution through local people with bicycles and local services. So there's almost a move to hyper-local, new alternative systems emerging, which we want to be alert to. So neither is wrong nor right, but it's between the two that we find a new emergence. That is so exciting if we can remain in tune with that. So having said that, I think one of the key tools for us is polarity management. Barry Johnson has written quite a lot on this. And there he really talks about that we are, all parts exist in a whole. So we have the positive of one, the negative of one pole, the positive of the other pole, negative of the other pole. So for example, if in this experience, if we're going to, first of all, map those polarities, we might say one of the tensions is how do I care for myself and how do I care for the community? Initially, we might think it's an either or, but in fact, the mindset of saying it's a both and really helps us in this. So I'm not solving for one problem or solving for the other, but I'm finding a way to integrate and hold both tensions and polarities. But if one is off kilter, if one is overemphasized over the other, we lose a sense of actually being able to serve or find new systems. So, for example, if I'm only serving myself, so I'm the one axis, if I'm absolutely focused on myself, if I'm buying all the toilet paper, if I'm really cutting myself off from people that I've employed before, that I'm becoming almost selfish in my perspective, then of course the other side of that pole is not paid attention to. Equally, if I'm not paying attention to myself, then I'm not looking after my health, my family, my economy, my social circles, then I'm also not serving the communal. Because there will be in the end an implication for that, for the school, the shops, and other parts that I connect with. So we find in polarity management that it's not about being too much of the other or too little of the other, but it's about finding that dynamic flow between them. So it's almost that if I'm too much of the one, I'll swing down to the other pole and pay more attention to the communal. So now actually I realize I need to be paying more attention to interacting systems, but if I'm too focused on other and on other communities, on other systems, then I'm neglecting my own, so I'll swing back. I find that such a useful way of really being able to hold those tensions, both within myself, but also in quite a concrete application. So polarity management really gives us that way of saying, let's name the tensions. So some of the tensions certainly that I've seen, and I'm sure you can add to these, are that tension between caring for myself, my basic needs, my sort of Maslow hierarchical needs, versus the need of the social good, of economic, societal, political good. The tension of looking short term. So actually, how do I get food on my table next month versus long term? Is this the best economy that actually is serving all? Is it the most inclusive? There's a tension between national interest versus global interest. So we see that playing out between East and the West and how those are shifting. And now there's no wrong nor right, but both coexist. So how do we shift our attention and our action between looking at one to the other and flowing a dynamic movement between those? Second question of where do I sit within this? So what I find useful to do in this is to have an issue, to think of a question, and then to find a way to navigate through it. So the second issue that I'm looking at is, how do you see yourself in this situation? And the question to sit with here is, what's becoming clearer to you that's important and meaningful to you right now? And that'll help you then look at, so where do I want to lead myself, and how do I see a regenerated world and humanity going forward? What is your purpose? What are your values? And then you can begin to say, with that in mind, what else is possible for me? Who do I want to be next? Who do I want to be next? So questions of identity, and individual intention come in here. And there is another question then of, how do I balance not only my interest now, but with a long-term mindset? So a question that's really useful there, a question can be a tool and a reflection and a prompt for action. In this case, the question is, how do you want to be remembered in these times? Or how do you want to remember yourself in these times? Another way of putting that is, what stories do you want told of yourself in these times? That was certainly a jolt for myself when I was sitting in a particularly poor mood and feeling stuck between how to solve these bigger issues. And I thought, I want to be have memories of really being action-oriented, contributing to conversations to evolve new ways. So this is also linked to Keegan's notion of adult development, where we move from a socialized mind, where we are really taking on the societal values and beliefs, and we begin to question, so how am I in this, and locate ourselves and our own agency in this. So the next phase, you might talk about the self-authoring mind, where we begin to form our own or contrary beliefs and opinions. The ideal, or the next level, would be the self-transforming mind. How do we shift, not just understanding these are the polarities, but actually beginning to see emergence and possibilities, and beginning to focus in on where are the examples of where this is working. Where are there ways that a new economic order is panning out? How are the old economic and political systems actually being eroded? And where can we step in to find alternates? So this comes to the fourth question. And this is really about what steps can I take? So what can I help enable is a really useful question that Jennifer Garvey Berger poses in her book, Leadership Mind Traps. Instead of saying, what can I control? Because in times of complexity, we can't control, we can't predict, we simply do not know the way forward. So a useful question there is, what can I help enable? So I can't control it, I can't predict it, but I can certainly take steps now to enable a system of connecting, of regenerating. So how do I see this microcosm of myself, my hyper-locality, and sense and act in ways that can move towards creating that future, that ideal future that we might want? So here I'm drawn to complexity thinking as some tools or ways of thinking about things. There's a fantastic article by Danny Hillis where he talks about we've moved from the age of enlightenment to the age of entanglement. Dave Snowden and colleagues were talking about how we're in an age of entanglement at the moment, that actually it's not about just simple, complicated, or even complexity about how do we shift systems, but that it really is truly entangled, and that we are absolutely in a different age. And so in this entanglement, it's not about unraveling or solving problems or being quite linear in our mindset, but it's about saying, where are those nodes that I can tap into in the messiness, in the entanglement? Where can I enable flows of different information? How can I connect ideas that maybe weren't connected before? So we think broader, but we're enabling different networks and different flows of information. That's quite a different mindset when you're in polarities, to say, I'm not solving for one, I'm not fixing one. I can't just fix the healthcare system. I need to look much broader. I need to look at alternatives to what would a healthy world look like. So we can't rely on just individual agency. We can't solve this. We're in this global entanglement.
If you wish to further explore the topic of paradox, we recommend works by French philosopher Michel Foucault. For more on the topic of perspective, it is worth reading Margaret Mead's ethnographic research on the role culture plays in shaping worldviews and personality.
If you would like to participate in this series or ask our speakers any questions, you can reach out to us through our website, www.omniology.co.za, or on social media at omniology_za.